The history of human rights as we know today began mostly during the post-World War II phenomenon known as the human rights movement. This widespread movement gained massive popularity by optimistic leaders after the devastating war, which saw one of the single greatest loss of lives of persons at any time in history. The movement featured strong beliefs that imperialism, colonialism, slavery, racism, patriarchy, and oppression were not only inherently backwards ideals, but most importantly inhuman to conduct such actions against one person. These ideals of personhood have seen nations across the world adopt these concepts. For nations who actively acknowledge and respect human rights, they typically follow the guidelines of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. This bold declaration, made shortly after World War II, founded several rights, which were considered unenforced laws of what a human should be guaranteed after recognizing their personhood. As this document was accepted by more and more United Nations states, it was expected that nations would follow the words in the declaration to the best of their ability. The human rights movement strongly aided the writing of this grand constitution of human rights. This movement did not spawn overnight, because the world was once embroiled in the most terrible conflict, however. These ideals date back centuries, at least well into the 17th century, when humanist and philosopher the Englishman John Locke, of whom much of his philosophy helped formulate the idea of the natural rights of mankind. If this term sounds familiar to many Americans, it is indeed his ideals that went into the Constitution of the United States. Lockean fundamental rights includes the ideals of humans having a natural right to life, liberty, and estate. Called the social contract, Locke postulated these ideals in the form of universality, something that all persons were entitled to, and any breaker of the social contract as an oppressor was oppressing the natural order of man. However, what is not stated about Lockean values of human rights, the social contract, and fundamental rights is while they are viewed as both natural and universal, the core tenets of Lockean philosophy is extremely Christian-based in ideology. Locke, much like many of the Enlightenment thinkers of the day, despite claims to rationalism and humanism, would root much of their thought in classical Christian theology with more humanistic twists. In fact, Locke himself was an ardent Calvinist who strongly dabbled in Christian theology regarding the original sin. He was heavily inspired by the biblical Genesis 1 and 2 for writing the ideals of the natural order. He believed much of the social contract was a fundamental God-given right by the Creator to man. In fact, he was such a strong believer until he, while a very tolerant person, urged authorities to not accept atheists in society. The reason behind this was Locke feared that an atheist rejecting God would upset the natural order and cause chaos to be unleashed. From Locke to the United States Declaration of Independence to later philosophers such as Thomas Paine and John Stuart Mill, a commonality in human rights was their universality came from the Creator. If their universality was to come from the Creator, who Christians identify typically as God, then a continual issue was that human rights as we understand them do not apply to everyone. This scenario arises from the fact that the so-called universal human rights practiced today are predominantly a Christian, Western, and global North creation, theorized in a period of imperial domination by the empires of Europe and the United States, and attempted to enforce these ideals on both themselves and their subjects, even if they barely considered some of their subjects as people, both during the height of imperialism and after. Years after the height of Enlightenment thinking and back to the ongoing human rights movement, much of the religious aspect of Western human rights has been removed or repressed. This is to make human rights more appealing to those who may be more progressive minded. As the theological aspect of human rights has been silenced, this does not preclude the fact that the ideals of human rights remains the same. As they remain the same regardless of the Christian theological aspect, human rights still have this idea of natural universality. However, as the original belief was this universality came from the Creator, the largest change is that now the universality comes from humans themselves. In fact, originally, human rights were dubbed natural rights. As natural rights fell out of popularity due to their Christian connotation, the core concepts did not change, however. This has caused much debate over if the ideas of the universality are actually a new form of Western and Christian imperialism. Many nations now shirk away from human rights as the West knows due to this fear and understanding that human rights developed in Christian theology. For example, in the Islamic world, mind you, this is not universal to them as well, in 1990, the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights was declared, specifically invoking Sharia law, in which the freedom of religion was repressed, punishment against women was considered acceptable, and violence against non-Muslims was justified. Revised in 2020 to be less harsh from the 1990 version, the Declaration still carries much of the same weight it did 30 years ago. This leads to many nations in the Muslim world unfortunately throwing what we Westerners view as fundamental human rights out the window, to which they justify behind Islam. Called cultural relativism, many nations argue that since their nations and people are not Western or Christian, applying Christian morality and decent values of natural rights on them is inherently wrong and imperialist. Arguably, as Western human rights were founded and is deeply rooted in Christian theology, some argue that we have no rights to argue if they are right or wrong, and we act based both in our religious values. However, a major problem in human rights universality is where to draw the line on pushing universal human rights. Is the question of what truly is the desire of a person. Some have claimed that cultural relativism is nothing more than a byword for oppressive regimes to keep oppressing the individuals in their nation. However true this is or not can be strongly argued, as most who argue against cultural relativism exist within the Western world. Again, the universality of human rights is used as a counter-argument. But harkening back to earlier arguments to human rights universality being a new form of imperialism, how can we be sure if cultural relativity is not actually an excuse? An important counterargument to cultural relativity lies in the fact that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was indeed drafted by many persons across many cultures. However, given our almost admitted westernization mission of the United Nations, which oversees the Universal Declaration, the actual relativity and universality for all persons is almost always going to be debated by the East and the West. On a final note, the argument against human rights universality mainly lies in what the current Declaration of Human Rights holds as basic human rights. Nearly all nations accept that all humans have some core fundamental valuation of their personhood and should be granted human rights. In 2005, the 2005 World Summit, it was clearly defined and stated that the universal nature of human rights and freedoms is beyond question. With such a powerful statement, internationally human rights are indeed recognized. But what are the universal human rights the UN claims to exist will perhaps forever be argued. Will human rights finally reach a degree of universality wherein all men are created equal? Will the global East and West, North and South finally agree on a non-biased and non-religiously influenced list of basic human rights? The status of universal nature of human rights and freedoms beyond question is unfortunately unknown, but hopefully we as a collective society of persons can vow to make life as better as possible for our fellow man.